Over the years, Venerable has taught the sadhana on the meditation of the Buddha and how to cultivate a close relationship with him. And she's tried a lot of angles. She's come from different texts, she's come from different commentaries, she's come from her own experience in order to help us bring the Buddha to life, to look at his good qualities so that we can see him as a reliable refuge, someone to be trusted and whose teachings can be depended upon to attain those things that we really deeply yearn for, which is this lasting peace and joy, to be able to be of the greatest benefit, and to become a Buddha. At the same time, she also taught us to be vigilant in regards to projecting unconsciously any type of overlay onto him or to ourselves that can become a really powerful obstacle in trying to cultivate this close, intimate relationship with the Buddha. And so I have a journey to share specifically around overlays, and maybe it'll be helpful, maybe it won't, but I wanted to share this personal journey. And it has to do with how my religion of origin influenced my perception of the Buddha as well as my perception of myself. And these misconceptions were huge obstacles for me maintaining and getting a close and trusting relationship, not only to the Buddha, but to myself. So from the beginning, which is now over 20 years, my first encounter with Buddhism was through the Dharma. I felt extremely connected to it. It went right into my heart the first time I ever heard it. But there was for many, many years, a disconnect regarding my ability to feel close to the Buddha. Not only in my mind learning how to do visualizations and to look at his good qualities, but to really bring him into my heart. There was something else. There was this sense that the Buddha was out there, far away, unrelated to the Dharma, aloof, inaccessible, whereas the teachings were right here, right now. I could take them to heart, I could practice them, I could grow, but the Buddha was some disconnected external entity that I didn't have much of a relationship with. I loved the Dharma, but I wasn't too sure about the Buddha. But in 2009, 2010, so I'm already practicing 10 years, and I've been having this struggle as hard as I try to connect with the Buddha and bring him into my life. I can't. But in 2009, 2010, when we had our winter retreat and I was preparing to go to Taiwan for my full ordination, so I thought refuge would be a strong component of my practice that winter, that I uncovered something that really got my attention and began to explain this internal disparity I had on why I didn't feel connected or trusting to the Buddha, but I felt connected and trusting to the Dharma. In fact, during that retreat, I found myself getting really angry at the Buddha, really upset. I was focusing on refuge. I said, what is this upset about when I think about him? There's almost an aversion. So I spent the retreat pretty much unpacking this reaction. I discovered that underneath the surface, under the radar screen, I had been projecting the beliefs of my religion of my childhood onto him, and I was pissed. I projected an external savior onto him and was beginning to recognize through my practice that the Buddha was not going to save me from myself, from my confusion, my self-hatred, my anxiety, my depression, and I was upset. Just like Jesus, who I figured out decades before wasn't going to save me, the Buddha wasn't going to do it either. I had left my religion of my childhood because I realized this about Jesus. I realized this about God in my mind. That the thinking of a child and a teenager was, Jesus had died for my sins. He was called the sacrificial lamb. Yet I was told over and over again, through the course of my religious education for almost 17 years, that I was a sinner who was inherently flawed from the day I was born, even after Jesus had suffered those terrible things and had died so violently. Wasn't that supposed to take care of things for all of us, redeem us, save us? He and God the Father had figured this out. By his crucifixion, all would be forgiven, all would be saved. but I never experienced that as a truth for myself. Now, I'm sure there are people of Christian faith that have a very different experience of Jesus the Savior and find great solace, great faith in that relationship. I just happen to not be one of those people. In fact, I was also upset and confused that even as a child, I was told that I was fundamentally bad in here somewhere. And that if I just believed in God and I just obeyed Jesus, that would atone for some unworthiness and would make me a good child. I could never reconcile this. And when I was 18, I walked away from my religion of my childhood. But I walked away physically, but I didn't walk away internally from those messages and that ideology. What ended up happening was I was unconsciously projecting external savior onto the Buddha, hoping that if Jesus couldn't save me, surely the Buddha could. After all, I still had this very deep belief that I was intrinsically flawed and unworthy, and that I still needed to be saved by somebody out there. So in that retreat, it became clear to me that I had imputed an external savior onto the Buddha. And if I just prayed, waited it out, did some practice, called myself a Buddhist, that some epiphany, some miracle from Buddha would occur to correct this inherent flaw of mine. So even though the Dharma was working on my mind, I could see changes internally, and I was becoming a really better person. This unconscious belief that I was not only fundamentally unworthy, but incapable of saving myself was still running way down in the deep, and that I still needed to be saved by Buddha. Because I still had my afflictions, I still had my hatred, I still had my attachment. Where the heck was he? He was supposed to do this for me. So I saw how this false narrative about who the Buddha was supposed to be kept him so far away from me. He was distant, he was inaccessible, unloving, and worst of all, uncaring. I was asking him, what I came to realize that winter retreat was that I was asking him to do the impossible. No one could save me. If the Buddha could have, he would have, eons ago. It's my own mind, my own karma, my own afflictions, and it's my own responsibility to free myself. I had glued the sign Savior right on the top of my visualization of the Buddha, and I didn't even know it. And to think of the Buddha like this, it was very disempowering. So for many years, I felt somewhat helpless. I felt the continual, inherently flawed, not quite capable, and that he couldn't help me. So I spent most of that retreat and a few years later more dismantling these projections about him and myself. And I want to share some of the things that I did to help me work back, to bring him back home into my heart. So first of all, what I did is I searched out any stories about his life, anything. You know, whether from the historians, the scholars, the great masters, just to put together some piece of what he was like as a being. I also went looking for stories about his disciples and what were their relationships to him like. How did he guide them? How did he model for them? Because so many of them, thousands of them, gained realizations. Honestly, I was looking for evidence that he was worthy, that he was a reliable guide. And in the Mahayana tradition in particular, this is another piece that helped me, is that they say at one time he had been just as afflicted, just as confused, just as suffering as we are, and had undergone great internal transformation with the Dharma over many eons, culminating in this awakening. That he wasn't always a Buddha. I cannot tell you how important that construct was for me in my healing with him. That Buddhas have not always been Buddhas, that they don't grow on trees, that they have to actually study and practice just as I am trying to study and practice. Or I could have easily put him back out there as another external entity. I had to bring him in and connect him to my life experience as a sentient being. And this concept really helped me. I mean, and yet that he chose also the earth to be a wheel-turning Buddha I find that just, it makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I mean, he's been a real turning Buddha probably in many universes, but the fact that he chose this earth, because I had to take this so personally, he did this for all of us. And the one piece that really did sort of culminate this healing with me and the Buddha is that in 2013, Venerable Chinny and I went to India. And we took a month and we did a pilgrimage. And so we visited the sites that are said to be where he was born, where he awakened, where he taught, where he meditated, where he lived, where he passed into nirvana. Just the thought of walking in a country that he walked in brought the Buddha into my own personal internal sphere. He could have walked away, walked into the sunset after his awakening, and gone into some sublime anonymity. But he didn't. He couldn't. It was like he knew too much about the origin and the causes of all the dukkha, every experience that all of us have experienced as sentient beings. And he knew this vicious cycle of existence could be eliminated, and he knew how, and he laid it out in living color. That's the piece that really, he discovered something, and he shared it, and he laid it out for us. So now when I visualize him, once again, 20 years, it took 10 years after that epiphany and that winter of 2010, that his eyes have a tenderness and an understanding in them for me. He knows what we're up against. He knows all about samsara because he floundered in it himself. And he knows how addictive, how hypnotizing it can be, and how vicious and boundless it is and the suffering that it brings. And so when he gazes at us, he gazes at me, he knows all of that. That's the limitless compassion that he has. And has helped me to have some compassion, some tenderness, and some respect for myself and for others. And to show me and to show all of us that we are capable, that we have to do the work, and that he'll guide us every step of the way. So over the years, he has slowly become the Buddha jewel, the Dharma jewel, and the Sangha jewel, all rolled into one for me. So I recommend that if you find the Buddha up in the clouds somewhere, or he's judging you, or you're feeling unworthy of his compassion or incapable of transformation, I suggest doing some exploration to make sure that you don't have some misleading signage on the Buddha and on yourself.